Hello, and welcome back to Worm From Home, a podcast exploring the environmental history of East London. This is the second of a short series of episodes thinking about war and the woods, and how their intertwined histories led to a woodland growing in Bethnal Green. Last time, we traced the history of woodlands and woodsmanship in Britain, from the time the landscape was densely forested wildwood to the early 20th century, when only a small amount of managed woodland remained. This is the second chapter of that story. If you missed the first episode, do go back and give it a listen before getting into part 2. At first glance, woodlands and warfare could not be less similar. A self-sustaining natural system in which organisms live and die, kill and reproduce in enough of a balance to maintain a living ecosystem over time, versus a human undertaking in which life and the conditions of life are deliberately destroyed. We tend to experience woodland as a peaceful place, at least from a human point of view. So it feels surprising, maybe, that the war and the woods are so connected, with woodland as a site of war, a consequence of war, and as one of a stock of resources for armed conflict's relentless engines. There are 3 strands that I think are really interesting here. Woods as the site of military damage, woodland as a war resource, and new woodlands as one way environments change after war. War has to happen somewhere, and there is nowhere that is outside of the environment. Everywhere has its own ecology, has air and water, plants and animals of some kind, and an inherently destructive activity like war will likely disrupt this ecology in some way. What might be the oldest known deliberately made war graves known to archaeology are in Sudan, at a cemetery site now known as Jebel Sahaba. It contains the mortal remains of 61 people, likely killed during ongoing waves of organised violence over 13,000 years ago. We don't know what ideologies or material gains these people were fighting over, what they thought would happen to them when they died, how they coped with the fear and pain of repeated violence, how warfare wrote itself into their intangible culture, into stories or social conventions or songs. We do know that they probably hunted and fished, and that their technology was realised primarily in stone. But we don't know who they were, or what their putative wars were for in any real sense, although recent scholarship has suggested that this pattern of conflict might, ironically, have been caused by competition between different groups for habitable land during a period of intense climate change. The environment in which these people lived may have informed how they fought, and its particularities helped to preserve their bodies and allow us to study their deaths today. But their conflict left no lasting alteration of that landscape. Enduring marks of war on the non-human landscape seem not to have been a feature of their war. Perhaps part of this is simply a matter of time. Human timescales may pale in comparison to geological time, but hundreds or thousands of years are more than enough for animal, plant, meteorological and other systems to cover, erase or reconstitute evidence of human activity. Human activity at a sufficient scale can overwrite its own history too. Today, the Jebel Sahaba site is under the Aswan High Dam. Geographer Joseph Hoopy makes an argument that I find quite compelling, that while war is an ancient activity, the military ability to inflict ecological damage that is substantial and long-lasting has changed and increased significantly over the last few hundred years, and that this capacity is closely tied to industrialization more broadly. In this telling, historical wars that predate industrialization have not only had their environmental traces washed away, as it were, by time, but were less disruptive to the environments in which they took place to begin with. As warfare industrialized through the 19th century, developments in both weaponry and transportation made war more resource-intensive, broadened its scope away from carefully chosen battlefields, and so made its interactions with ecosystems more damaging and long-lasting. Explosive munitions, for example, damage the land along with the human beings or structures that they target. Increased use of road and rail travel for army logistics and the replacing of horses with motorised military vehicles and tanks all cut more and more miles of temporary and permanent routes, usually increasing carbon emissions and pollution as they went. Much of this industrialisation of warfare, of course, came to a head in the First World War and its vast devastation. Like every case study we will cover in this episode, even a potted history of this war is entirely outside of our scope. Instead, we're going to focus on particular environmental effects of this and other conflicts. 20 million or more people died in the Great War, split roughly evenly between civilian and military deaths. Of the 10 million or so combatants killed, several million died in battle on the Western Front, the churning, insatiable meat grinder that late imperial generals fed with the bodies of young men and the mud of France and Belgium. The Battle of Verdun was a particularly bloody episode of this stalemate, a 10-month battle between French and German forces over control of the Verdun fortified region that even before the war had housed a French military garrison of tens of thousands of personnel. 300,000 people were killed in the fight to hold this piece of land, and that land itself was also fundamentally transformed by the means of this slaughter. The Western Front of the First World War saw the massive expansion of trench warfare, with soldiers holding land by fighting and often living in trenches dug into the ground. This development in warfaring was partly spurred by advances in the destructive capacity of both infantry and artillery weapons. Longer-range infantry weapons pushed artillery fire increasingly to the back of advancing fronts. The increased range and destructive capacity of artillery shells themselves allowed them to be fired from relatively far behind the lines without a direct line of sight on remotely communicated targets. These targets were often enemy defences rather than enemy combatants themselves. All along the Western Front, soldiers literally dug themselves in and pelted the ground around each other with shells. During the Battle of Verdun alone, an estimated 60 million shells were fired. As well as the enormous death toll, the damage wrought on the landscape in which the battle took place was devastating. Much of this damage was a direct result of munitions use. Shells of this era exploded upon contact with the ground, unlike later iterations of such munitions that can detonate before impact. Shells detonating on impact with the ground in this way caused huge disruption to the ground itself, particularly as the near-stalemate conditions forced the repeated shelling of small areas over and over. The ground became pocked with craters, whole landscape features rearranged, and fragments from the exploding shells driven hard into the ground as well as anything on the surface. The damage was so extensive that after the armistice, the French government designated the whole area around Verdun from Nancy to Lille as Zone Rouge, or a red zone. This area, comprising some 150,000 hectares, was deemed by the post-war government as too dangerous to human life and too expensive or difficult to clean and make habitable. A widely quoted excerpt from a post-war report on the area summarised the situation thus: damage to agriculture, 100%. Impossible to clean. Human life, impossible. As well as the damage to soil structures, plant life was also destroyed at unprecedented rates by explosive detonations. The land in the red zone had been a mix of farmland and woodland. After the war, huge swathes of these woods had been either destroyed or damaged beyond recovery by tree trunks being impregnated with shrapnel. The farmland within the red zone did not fare better. As well as the extensive cratering from direct shell hits, any attempt to restore the land for arable use was prevented by the hazards now embedded in the earth. Of the approximately 60 million shells fired at Verdun, anywhere between 1/8 and 1/4 never detonated. They, along with countless unexploded grenades, ammunition, and most dangerously gas shells, remained in the ground in numbers so large it was deemed too dangerous to even attempt to clear the land for agrarian use. Even if this unexploded ordnance could have been swiftly removed, the soil itself was both severely damaged and dangerous. A government munitions clearing agency has worked to slowly clear the area, and the size of the red zone has shrunk over time. Even decades after the end of the First World War, up to 50 tons of material could still be pulled out of the ground every year. And the ground from which these unspent munitions were pulled has itself been fundamentally altered. The contamination of the soil is multifold, and both prevents plant life from growing in similar ways to before the war, or growing at all, and can be dangerous to animal life, including human beings, by exposure. All the fatal weapons of warfare deployed at Verdun inflicted their own damage on the soil. Material from exploded munitions and the remnants of gas from chemical shells left high levels of lead, mercury, and chlorine in the ground. Attempts at post-war cleanup in some cases worsened the problem. At what is now known as the Place à Gaz, unexploded gas shells were burned after the war as a form of disposal. This has left the surrounding soils with 35,000 times the typical level of arsenic, and little of anything grows here. The human destruction also itself had secondary impacts on the non-human environment. The rubble of 9 evacuated and subsequently destroyed villages still stand in the red zone, as do the ruins of bunkers and trenches constructed during the war. As we noted, at Verdun, 300,000 people were killed, alongside a large number of animals. Not all of these bodies were recovered. While it is well known that many of the fallen soldiers of the First World War are commemorated in mass cemeteries at sites of battle, rather than with individual graves of their remains, we understandably spend less time thinking about what actually did happen to their bodies. Many were simply left in the mud, in whole or dismembered. One such instance is a human tragedy, an inability to engage in grieving rituals that close off a life and allow a community to continue living. At Verdun, where an estimated 80 to 100,000 men were left on the battlefield, it is also an ecological disaster. Environments in which such mass death does not usually occur can be catastrophically impacted by the sudden introduction of so much decomposing matter. Soil composition is altered, and, of course, the presence of so much dead animal matter is directly biohazardous to human life as well. Industrialization created the capacity for the early wars of the 20th century to be orders of magnitude more destructive to human beings and the places they lived and fought than before, and this is a trajectory that has persisted. A fossil fuel economy has brought many things into closer ecological relationships than they were. Warfare in the industrial age is capable of inflicting environmental damage far from the direct sites of battlefields. Military activity accounts for a significant proportion of the greenhouse gases emitted that contribute to global warming and subsequent climate change. Just how large a proportion, however, is difficult to determine precisely. Evaluating the climate impact of war and the world's militaries is hampered by what is sometimes referred to as the military emissions gap, that is, a marked lack of available emissions data related to conflict and armed forces. Most countries do not track their military emissions in the same way that they track civil emissions, and this very much includes countries with large armies and world-leading military spending. Historically, carbon emissions generated by military activity have been notable by their absence from major climate summits and the accords they have set out. They were exempt, for example, from agreements made at the 1997 Tokyo summit. 18 years later, the Paris Agreement of 2015 ostensibly introduced greater transparency into global emissions reporting and requires all signatories to conduct and submit a national inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. Other reporting, for example on how party countries are working on strengthening resilience to climate change, is encouraged but is not mandatory. However, there is considerable flexibility in what countries are mandated to include in the national audits submitted to the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change. There is no requirement to submit information on the greenhouse gases emitted by a country's military. Signatories are left to do this at their own volition, should they so choose. This obviously creates a serious problem for accurately measuring the effect of military activity on global warming. This might not be such a problem if the environmental impact of conflict and its machines were small. However, from the data that is available, it is reasonable to assume that it is not. To an extent, this is also a reasonable assumption in its own regard. Militaries are fuel-intensive enterprises, commanding fleets of land, water and air vehicles, both for use in warfighting itself and to maintain large-scale supply lines. All of this burns a lot of fuel. Researchers have found ways around the military emissions gap, using data that is available from the reporting that does exist, as well as related academic studies, to create models of military carbon impacts. In 2022, Scientists for Global Responsibility, in association with the Conflict and Environment Observatory, released the results of a widely publicised study estimating the greenhouse emissions released by militaries across the world. To generate estimates of these emissions, Lindsay Cottrell and Stuart Parkinson developed a method that combined 4 different values. the emissions generated by the energy used by one stationary member of military personnel, the number of military personnel, the ratio of emissions generated by stationary personnel versus military movement, for example, vehicle emissions, and the emissions generated by the military supply chain. The resulting estimate was that globally, military activity accounts for 5.5% of total carbon emissions. The point here is not that the Paris Agreement or similar international accords are ideal or even very good measures for halting or mitigating climate change, but diplomatically mediated international cooperation through geopolitical security bodies like the UN define the mainstream of climate change action. They are not the best we can do, but they are the best that those with the most power to effect change are currently doing. The failure to include military emissions in mandatory reporting is therefore a meaningful indication of how seriously or not the environmental damage of armies and armed conflict is taken, and equally of what nation-states are unwilling to risk in their climate action. In this framework, war is treated as something we need, something the pursuit of which cannot be interfered with by restrictions on emissions. This is of course not the case for other things you might believe that we need, like food, the production emissions of which are routinely reported, and whose very availability depends upon reducing the rate at which the Earth is warming. So, war has to happen somewhere, and the weapons and logistics of warfare will inflict damage on those areas, just as the people within them. As human technological capacity, particularly within a fossil fuel economy, increases, the scope of military damage can be seen to increase too. But as well as an incidental site of armed conflict, environments, and in particular woodlands, can also themselves be direct resources for warfare. For forces familiar with the terrain, they can provide valuable cover for combatants and supply lines. Wood and timber have historically been crucial conflict materials. This usefulness both destroys woodlands and sometimes, counterintuitively perhaps, can protect them. In Britain, the economic protection of woodlands we mentioned in Part 1 could extend to military use also, when well-maintained woodlands were required to provide wood products for the army and navy. However, as warfare became increasingly industrialised and, like many human endeavours, began to consume resources on a much larger scale, timber began to replace wood as the valued material that woodlands could provide. Post-First World War forestry studies showed that globally, felling materials was one of the top 3 causes of wartime tree loss. In Britain alone, 182,000 hectares of woodland had been felled for the war effort by its conclusion in 1918. Woodlands can fare very badly, even when a military considers them to be, as it were, on their side. When woods are the site of the enemy, they of course fare much, much worse. The term ecocide was very likely first used to describe the direct military attacks on the forests of the Mekong Basin during the American War in Vietnam. Fighting in their own lands, the North Vietnamese forces and Viet Cong were able to successfully exploit landscape features for military advantage. Dense forest canopies provided cover for combatants, but also crucially for supply lines. The Ho Chi Minh Trail predated the war with America and South Vietnamese factions. A sprawling network of routes, mostly taken on foot and by bicycle, these miles-long human chains of material through the forests had first developed in the 1940s and 50s during the First Indochina War against French colonial rule, and were later expanded. Alongside the natural tree cover, supply runs could also be hidden from aerial reconnaissance with inexpensive tricks exploiting landscape characteristics, like weighting branches to bend them over paths that were otherwise exposed, hiding them under an artificial canopy. To the American military, these forests were not a boon, but a problem. The inability to properly surveil enemy supply lines was a considerable tactical disadvantage, but dense forestation also posed a serious problem to the US Army's ability to deploy its own troops and material. To create landing zones for helicopter-deployed soldiers, create spaces for bases, as well as to destroy cover, American forces systematically destroyed forests in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Like in the First World War, a portion of this environmental destruction was accomplished with explosive munitions. B-52 aircraft made carpet bombing runs that cut huge swathes out of the landscape, as well as dropping bombs of up to 1,000 pounds over forested areas. Specialised daisy cutter bombs were dropped with parachutes and detonated once their slow descent had placed them in the perfect position above ground to do maximum damage to a wide radius of surrounding vegetation. The American military even experimented with chemical means to induce dehydration in vegetation to allow incendiary bombs to be used to artificially set massive forest fires, though this with limited success. The mechanism of deliberate environmental destruction with the largest impact in space and also through time was the use of herbicides. From 1962 until 1971, as part of Operation Ranch Hand, the US military conducted spraying flights over the Mekong Basin's forests. Among the various chemical defoliants used, with unnervingly innocuous names, Agent Green, Agent Pink, White, Purple, Agent Orange is the most notorious. Agent Orange, like many others, is a defoliating herbicide that chemically triggers leaf loss in broadleaf plants, like trees in tropical forests, by stimulating excessive growth hormone production. Defoliating agents were developed for peacetime uses as agricultural herbicides that can kill broadleaf weeds but leave grasses intact. But they had also previously been weaponized by British colonial forces themselves fighting communist independence forces amongst heavy canopy cover in Malaya, now Malaysia, in the 1950s. In the American War in Vietnam, US forces massively expanded on herbicide as a tool of war, and tens of millions of litres of defoliants were deliberately sprayed into forested areas. The ecological effects of this combination of assaults was, as intended, devastating. This was deliberate, massive environmental disruption used specifically as a tool of war, an attempt to reshape the landscape to the strategic benefit of one side, to deprive an enemy of the forest as both military and civil resource. Forest loss was massive. South Vietnam had had an estimated 10 million hectares of forest. After American forces withdrew, it was estimated that 1.65 million hectares of forest had been completely destroyed, an area over 10 times as large as the red zone left by the First World War in France. Herbicidal spraying, particularly with Agent Orange, had killed off huge areas of canopy, with damage particularly severe in areas that had been sprayed multiple times. In upland areas sprayed only once, at least 10% of trees were killed. Where spraying was done several times at similar elevations, that figure rises to between 50 and 100%. Munitions also did heavy damage to forests. In addition to the vegetation destroyed on contact by carpet bombings and by daisy cutter bombs, shells generating huge amounts of shrapnel upon detonation were also used. Millions of tiny fragments lodged irreversibly in tree trunks. Post-war forestry surveys indicated that 4% of Vietnam's forests were so damaged by the shrapnel that the trees could not even be used for timber. This rapid and violent deforestation was catastrophic for local biodiversity. In tropical forests, as in the European woodlands, it is the old-growth forest habitats that sustain the richest biodiversity of animal and other plant species. Surviving old-growth forests in Vietnam, with trees like the hardwood Hopea odorata, are home to thousands of animals, among them many rare conservation-threatened primates, as well as hairy-nosed otters, elfin mountain toads, crocodile lizards, and the critically endangered deer-like saola. The diversity and number of forest-dwelling species has been significantly reduced, and the ecosystem was left markedly less productive than it had been. Devastating as these losses are in and of themselves, the damage done went deeper, quite literally. Soil, water, and plant roots form crucial systems in many ecosystems, maintaining reasonably predictable hydration levels on which animal and plant life relies. Extensive and repeated aerial bombardment left much of the landscape literally cratered. Millions of pockmarks from bomb strikes dotted empty land where forests had once stood. Some areas may have undergone lateralization, where, without canopy cover, exposed soils dry out and become hard as rock. So it wasn't only the trees that were gone, but much of the ground in which they had grown. This put reforestation on a back foot. Surveys conducted in 2002 showed that forests in the region that were the most degraded quality largely overlapped with areas that had seen particularly heavy bombing. In some places, bombing was so deep that resulting craters broke through the bedrock and exposed the water table, making it almost impossible for deep-rooting trees to grow back. The vegetation that did start to self-seed first in these cleared areas therefore tended to be shallower, lower scrub plants that did not require such deep water sources and could grow in soils now far less nutritious than they had been. The absence of forest cover has altered soils in the long term, and this has had wide-ranging impacts on the entire Mekong Basin. Specifically, the hydrology of the area has changed, that is, how water is distributed within the landscape. In a forested environment, water leaves the soil in two ways: by evaporating straight out of the soil and by being taken into leaves via root systems and subsequently evaporating from the surfaces of leaves. When trees disappear, this latter process, called evapotranspiration, no longer occurs. This increases the level of water in the soil, which in turn increases runoff and erosion, which reduces the ability of soils to restore themselves after upheaval, lengthening the timeline of environmental recovery. Another factor in the longevity of this environmental damage has also been the effect, direct and indirect, on human beings themselves. The Vietnamese government estimates that over 4 million people were exposed to Agent Orange, and in particular to a highly toxic dioxin that is present in trace amounts in the Agent Orange formulation. Those exposed were both combatants and civilians living near heavily sprayed areas, and studies indicate that decades later, dioxin levels are still unusually high in both the non-human organisms like plants and the human blood and breast milk of people in these regions. Dioxin is so dangerous because when it enters the human body, it combined with a specific protein in human cells, enter the nucleus of those cells and then disrupt usual gene expression. Such disruption is associated with several different illnesses and disabilities, both acquired and congenital. Neurological problems, complex and severe learning difficulties and developmental disorders, dangerous malformations of physiological structures at birth, often leading to very early death, inability to conceive and stillbirth, a whole array of cancers, gastrointestinal problems, and autoimmune diseases. Vietnam's Red Cross estimate that today up to 1 million Vietnamese people are sick or disabled because of dioxin exposure. Because dioxin interferes with how genes are expressed, illness can occur in the children and grandchildren of those originally exposed, even if those people were never themselves exposed to the original sprayings. This pattern is also seen in some descendants of foreign soldiers from countries including the US, Canada, and Australia, whose children never even set foot in the sprayed areas. The United States has repeatedly maintained that its herbicidal spraying during the war in Vietnam was not a deliberate attack on people per se, nor a crime under international law governing the use of chemical weapons. Perhaps unsurprisingly, legal pressure put on both the American government and several chemical corporations involved in the manufacture of Agent Orange for military applications has been more successful from American veterans of the war in Vietnam than from Vietnamese civilian victims of dioxin. In 1984, a group of chemicals companies paid out $180 million in a pre-trial settlement to American war veterans, and the Veterans Association for Former US Soldiers pays enhanced benefits to veterans suffering from presumed dioxin-induced illness. Legal challenges brought by groups like the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange, in partnership with international allies, have seen less success. In 2005, and again on appeal in 2007 and 2009, American courts have dismissed the case that the use of herbicidal defoliants violated sections of the Hague and Geneva Protocols, in part because Agent Orange is not a chemical weapon in the manner of poison gas intended to kill human beings, and any effects on people the United States considers incidental. But the environment around us is the very space in which we must exist. What does it even mean to say that we can draw hard and fast lines between environmental features as a target for war versus combatants or civilians in the same area? The potential carcinogenic effects of dioxins in animals, including humans, were known as early as the mid-1960s. That decade also saw repeated protests and alarms raised, including within the United States, about the direct and indirect dangers to human beings from herbicidal spraying. By 1971, Operation Ranch Hand was officially ended after a US Department of Defense decision to cancel the use of dioxin-containing chemicals. However, the South Vietnamese government did continue their use up until the mid-1970s. The environment around us is our resource for life. Much contemporary opposition to Agent Orange highlighted the massive effects on local populations, not from dioxin-induced illness, but from the environmental destruction caused. It was not only forests that were destroyed by herbicidal spraying, but agricultural land also. In some cases, these were the same place, as for some ethnic minority people living in mountain areas, practicing rotating slash-and-burn farming within the jungle itself. While forests are our particular focus in this episode, agricultural land was inevitably exposed to Agent Orange, and American herbicidal spraying and bombing did deliberately target crop fields in rural areas, ostensibly to deprive enemy combatants of food sources, but also often severely disrupting food systems for local civilians. Wartime deforestation has also negatively impacted farming in the long term. Even in the 1990s, rice farmers were reporting unusually high and disruptive flooding in areas where forests had died off, very likely due to the type of increased water runoff we mentioned earlier. When our resources for life are destroyed, or the environment around us made dangerous, we move. Both bombing, spraying, and land campaigns created millions of refugees in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Geographer Jim Glassman has argued that this essentially constituted a forced urbanization, a mass population transfer from rural areas to cities. In Glassman's view, this reconcentration of people in cities is, whether it occurs incidentally or deliberately, geopolitically advantageous to the counterinsurgency efforts of material world powers like the United States, as it weakens the ability of anti-colonial movements to organize rurally and inserts more people into the economic production of global capital in urban areas. His is an interesting argument, and I will put a link to the paper in the bibliography. The destruction or protection of forests and woodland during war stems largely from the ways woods have been folded into human life. In interacting with humanity, woodlands have also become things other than just themselves. They become sites of resources, strategic cover, land to be held or lost. Woodland recovery after conflicts and its success or failure is of course also bound up in this human meaning. Woodlands can form part of the recovery of landscapes damaged by armed conflict. Or we could say that it is one way environments can change as the result of war. In many forested or previously forested parts of the world, including Europe and Southeast Asia, untended land tends towards a natural process of forestation, becoming what is often called secondary woodland. Secondary woodlands are formed by trees colonizing areas that had previously had some other use. In Britain, for example, an abandoned agricultural field is likely, with time, to become such a secondary woodland. Large areas of the Red Zone in France are now wooded, and much of that land was not previously wooded but was the site of villages or farms. Such forestation helps to restore soil quality and prevent erosion, even if progress is slow in a landscape where damage is so extensive. Ecologists estimate that it could take up to something like 300 years for the land to be fully restored, although progress is consistently being made in making new areas safer. I wonder whether it's likely that a landscape can ever be restored to some previous state, and whether it will actually move towards something new and a different healthy state. New or secondary woodlands do not always happen spontaneously, and creating new forest is unfortunately not just a simple matter of planting trees. As we discussed in part 1, it is the more complex woodlands that form environments for the richest diversity of life in both animals and other plants, and that will enrich soil ecosystems the most deeply over time. On the old First World War battlefields, several large monoculture plantations that were all one species were created, partly because of a reparations deal with Germany to provide France with large numbers of black forest pine. While certainly an improvement on bomb-cratered muddied ruins, such forestation is not as diverse an ecosystem as the one that preceded the war. Environmental restoration after catastrophe is not just an ecological process, but also a social and political one. Human activity inflicts damage, but human meaning, power, and values also shape how and how well recovery takes place afterwards. Ideological commitments and material interests are not only features of war, but of course continue in peacetime, are always present in our environmental interactions, even if the content of those pressures may vary and change. Post-war recovery of Vietnam's landscape had been greatly hampered by monoculture plantation and by further deforestation, this time not driven by armed conflict, but by economic pressures driving industrial and agricultural expansion. In part 1, we ended by noting that at the end of the First World War, British woodland coverage stood at an historic low, at only 5%, and that this deforestation had coincided with the decline of traditional woodland management. British woodlands were especially depleted by the Great War, when Britain had ceased to import timber from its empire or through international trade. In 1919, the government established the Forestry Commission, which has now become a group of forestry commissions, one for each devolved nation. The Forestry Commission's founding motivations were explicitly economic, to restore and increase Britain's ability to produce timber. The need to reforest quickly and a pressure to maximise the economic productivity of new woodlands led to a large-scale planting of monoculture forests. The Commission bought up great portions of land and brought it under state control, taking it out of the private hands of estates and farms. Some of this land already had woodland, both ancient or planted. Some had been recently felled in the war effort. The Forestry Commission also planted many new forests on sites purchased in previously unforested areas, especially in agriculturally unproductive places like grazing uplands in the north and heathlands in the south. This planting has helped increase canopy cover in Britain. Total wooded area rose steadily over the 20th and into the 21st century, and now stands at more than double that of 1919. However, canopy coverage is not everything, and a healthy forest is not guaranteed by just the presence of trees, which when planted in homogeneous groves will likely not become hosts for a diversity of other life. The ecological poverty of Britain's newly planted post-war forests was driven partly by a relatively new practice, forestry. Forestry, as distinct from woodsmanship, developed in European countries, especially Germany, during the 19th century as a, quote, scientific approach to woodland management, working with quantitative information collected about tree size, plantation yield, and so on. Scientific here has quite a specific definition. All sorts of approaches to woodlands and forests can use scientific methods for various reasons. The scientific nature of early forestry was specifically the use of data gathering to rationalise forest management for maximise yields of timber and wood products. This approach was not without any concern for sustainability, making sure forests did not die, that not too much canopy cover was lost, and that soils and local hydrology were protected from excessive erosion. Broader ecological concerns, however, featured minimally for the foresters that came to reforest Britain in the 1920s. Environmental historian K. Jan Oosthoek has argued that much of the ecological shortcomings of this era of forestry had colonial roots. Britain instituted systematic forestry practices in India almost half a century before the creation of the Forestry Commission. Working with German and French practitioners, British colonial government in India trained new foresters, founded teaching institutes, and implemented the practice widely to tackle both a timber shortage and growing erosion-related problems caused by massive imperial overlogging of India's forests. While this did see some success in restoring timber reserves, imperial forestry in India was disconnected, both ecologically and socially. Assumptions about tree species and climatic conditions that were true in Europe were transplanted to different biomes where they did not work. Many communities were also cut off from and denied access to the forests from which they had previously harvested and lived with. In Öztürk's telling, this colonial implementation hardened the already narrow scope of Victorian forestry, turning it into a practice that essentially ignored anything not directly related to a forest expansion and timber yields, even if those additional concerns were for the forest's own ecological health. I find this argument a really interesting treatment of how an interest in woodlands can push people to greater interactions with nature, but also towards mismanagement, particularly when scientists for an imperial core create a hierarchy of environments, while turning environmental features of their choosing entirely into commodities. I'll put a link to this Öztürk article in the bibliography that's available at the end of the series, and I'd really recommend it. It's a good read. Forestry practices have evolved, and today, conservation and ecological husbandry form much of the work of bodies like Forestry England. Over the course of the 20th century, greater environmentalist political campaigning, the passing of environmental protection laws, and increasing public interest in ecological protection have shaped the priorities of state-driven woodland management. Forestry in Britain is much more concerned than it was with encouraging biodiversity, protecting habitats, and ensuring that the maintenance of forests for wood product resources is balanced with the ability of the environment those forests comprise to maintain themselves richly in the long term. Vietnam, too, has undertaken large post-war forestation programs, in very different circumstances, of course, but under some very similar pressures to those that have shaped forestation in Britain. Reforestation programs to restore the devastated post-war jungles and attempt to mitigate the damage from as much as half of Vietnam's forest cover having been destroyed started in the 1970s. However, considerable logging and road building operations also took place during this period, and through the 1980s, forest cover in Vietnam continued to decline, reaching a nadir of 27 or 28% by the end of the decade. This echoes a trend across Southeast Asia as a whole, where forested areas fell from 66% total to 49% between 1960 and 1990. Since 1990's historical low, forestation and restoration programs in Vietnam have increased, and like in France and Britain after the First World War, large tree monocultures have been planted as part of this effort. This has helped to restore canopy cover, growing the forest coverage of Vietnam up to 42%. The Vietnamese plantation forests of pine, bamboo, and acacia can grow quickly, provide a large amount of wood and timber products on harvest, or both, but seldom match the country's old-growth forest in terms of biodiversity and animal life. Vietnam's monoculture plantations have been described as empty forests, where the only life present is really the trees themselves. These monocultures also don't protect soils from erosion quite as well as older-growth, more heterogeneous forests do. This is particularly the case when woods are planted for the purpose of repeated harvesting for timber. Quick-growing trees like acacias are planted and felled on relatively short cycles of as little as 5 years, repeatedly exposing the ground in which they grow to the erosion and leaching effects of rainfall. Non-native and fast-growing tree species helped reforest areas quickly and also grew Vietnam's wood products economy significantly, and the country is now a massive exporter of wood chips. This industry is worth around $185 million a year. The economic pressures on both forests and the shape of reforestation has undoubtedly been detrimental to the ecological recovery in the long term. But it's not quite as simple as a question of the greedy logging company, in this case a state-owned company, versus the forest. The question of livelihoods is complex. Part of what has driven the planting of quick-growing, quick-harvesting crops has been an urgent need among impoverished rural people to generate income quickly. Many experiencing severe poverty simply do not have time to wait for slower-growing native species to reach harvestable maturity in order to sell the wood products. In the 21st century, the Vietnamese government has made moves to provide more ecological protection for forested areas, including bans on excessive logging and instituting further ambitious tree planting programs. However, as in other parts of the world, such measures will not always work as intended if they aren't implemented in concert with those interacting with the forest and its resources the most. In and around the forests of Kien Nuok Trong, a survey of 300 households found that illegal logging generated as much household income as the sale of lawfully gathered forest products like honey and mushrooms, both at about 14%. People who rely so directly on forest harvesting for their livelihoods, of course, tend to know these landscapes intimately. They are not outsiders to these ecosystems, arriving from cities or even foreign countries to arrange for resource extraction, but people who live within them and clearly observe how they change over time. Today, several initiatives, including from the government, ecological groups, and those for whom the woods are a direct source of life, are working toward establishing more sustainable forest management practices, with many raising the alarm about the quality and vulnerability of forests across the country. In recent years, the Vietnamese government has transferred 3.4 million hectares of forest away from state logging companies and into direct community ownership. As in Britain, forestry is evolving away from its more extractive roots. In Dak Doa, a 50-year-old pine forest in the Vietnamese Central Highlands, local people from Bat Na and Jarai ethnic minority groups are concerned that the forests in which they farm and which plays a vital role in protecting the area's water resources is under threat. While originally a post-war plantation, after 50 years the Dak Doa forest has matured and become an important part of the region's ecosystem. Farmers graze cows in the grasses that grow among the pines, and the tree's presence has also helped to preserve the local water table. A massive development, including a golf course and real estate creation, now threatens this. Local authorities have reclassified some land to allow it to be sold for private villa development, and areas of pine have already been cleared or replanted in other areas with limited success. People there fear similar disruption to their water tables as has been experienced in the neighbouring areas that have seen considerable deforestation from logging. In particular, removing the forest is likely to disrupt long-standing local practices for collecting drinking water by diverting natural waterways with bamboo piping. Here, the protection of the forest is not at odds with any economic interest. Rather, the sustainability of local livelihoods depends on the forest's health, and both are threatened by the potential impact of the area pursuing an economic investment in large-scale, high-end real estate. In Dong Nai, in southern Vietnam, in a collaboration between foresters and farmers, slow-growing native hardwood trees are being planted interspersed with coffee plants. Local farmers can make money in the short term from coffee exports while the trees mature, and the presence of native trees that support animal life already helps create a more biodiverse environment than the coffee plantations did alone. The Kien Nuok Trong lowland forests, where illegal logging has been an economic lifeline for many, are also some of the most biodiverse and ecologically rich forests in the region. Here, ecological groups, in partnership with local residents, are developing strategies for better husbandry of the forest and its resources, including encouraging more sustainable management techniques in acacia plantations, so that the trees can still form a part of the local economic system while the negative impact on the forest ecosystem is minimized. I spent a long time while I was preparing this episode, wondering whether people recover along with the woodlands and other environments in which war has taken place. I think it depends on the form of recovery. The end of war does not suddenly free us from the indirect, and sometimes direct, violence of non-military forces of politics and capital asserting themselves in a landscape. Environmental management decisions made in a state of emergency are not always those that will hold in the long term, and the recovery of a post-war landscape will always come in stages. No fundamentally altered environment ever returns to the exact state that it was previously in, but it can become something new and something other than devastated. Next time, for the concluding episode of this series, we will be back in East London at the Bethnal Green Nature Reserve to see how an urban woodland formed a small part of both ecological and human recovery after a period of urban warfare. Some major sources for this episode were the works of Joseph Hoopy, Kay-Jan Öztürk and Jim Glassman, as well as material made available by the Vietnamese Association for Victims of Agent Orange. Several case studies of ecological restoration come from journalistic work, including by Mike Ives and Le Cunye. I will make a full bibliography available at the end of this series. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Worm from Home. If you've enjoyed the show and want to support production, you can do so with words by leaving a rating and a review on your podcast app, sharing the episode, or telling your friends and family. Or, if you'd like, you can support the show with money by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/wormfromhome. In either case, your support will be really appreciated. I make this show because I love radio and I love nature, but also to create opportunities to learn for myself and others. If you have any questions, feedback, or knowledge you'd like to share, or analyses of your own on the topics we cover, please do get in touch on the Patreon, at Worm From Home on Twitter, or Worm From Home Pod on Instagram. Until next time.